I used to even think that it was like, oh, it's just one day. It's not the most important day, but it is the birth of your parenting relationship. And so having it go badly does have a huge impact. It's not all beautiful. A lot of it is not of birth, of parenting, of life. A lot of life is really hard. I want to be over here, I want to be done. And that's not how healing works. I mean, healing is to go into it and feel it. The research says there is just as many men with birth trauma stories as there are women. And what if we were actually okay to cry with people? So we missed this opportunity to actually talk about this amazing thing that just happened. It's not just about birth. Alexa, heat on.
Oh, I forgot.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself from the very beginning, how it ended up you being a psychologist, a marriage therapist and counselor, and the one who's writing a book about healing stories?
Yeah, it's interesting to try to figure out where things start. Where does one start with a story? Because I think that I always was really fascinated with relationships. I'm the oldest of 5 children, and my parents had a up and down, crazy, fighting, loving marriage. And I think I was always watching it. And so I remember reading self-help books when no one else was reading self-help books. When I was 12 or 13, I was at the library wanting to understand relationships. And then I was the person that if you ever wanted to talk about a relationship, I was everyone's therapist when I was a teenager, you know. And so it was very clear to me that this is what I was made for. It's just, I really am drawn to helping people have better relationships. And so then I went to school and learned more and kept getting more like, oh, this is what I want and this is what I want. And the nice thing is it feels like every life experience I have has layered and I don't, it's not like I've tried to get here. I just kept living my life and then helping people and then living my life and helping people. And so my parents were going through a very ugly divorce. I was 20 years old. I always joke, if you throw your birth control pills up every day, they don't work very well. So at some point, I was so upset about my parents' marriage that I was very sick, and then I was pregnant. And there was an amazing moment where I had a crossroads in my life. And I knew I wanted to be a mother. My family knew I was way too young, and I can't recommend having a baby at 21. That's way too young. I was poor, I was alone. But it has been such an experience to kind of throw myself into the world of birth and parenting and relationships from that point forward. And so Nate is my greatest teacher in everything, and he's been with me, and he's now 38 years old, and we're super close, and I still keep learning from the people in my life. And so it's my life and the crazy things that happen to me and how I make sense of them, just like everybody else. And then what do you decide to do with that? And that led me to grad school and becoming a therapist, and then at some point wanting to help people with birth trauma because I had birth trauma. And then, then wanting to write a book because everybody should write a book because it's so cool to be on Amazon and have it say author. That's the coolest thing. Yeah. And then people want to talk to you about your book, which I love. My mother got pregnant when she was 20, and she gave a baby up for adoption. And so he is in my life, my half-brother. And so then I almost, you just seem to repeat our parents' stories. Like I ended up in the same position, but because the world had changed and I had more family support, I was able to keep my baby. And so in that way, my mother and I have had very similar paths, but I got to have more privileged choices, I think.
What I've learned from my profession as a doula, from my experience as a doula, and also from your book, is that preparing to childbirth doesn't work. I mean, how it is right now, as we see. Yeah. So my question is, what is the best way to prepare to childbirth?
Oh, that is so complicated because I feel like on one side, There are people that just do whatever the doctor tells them to do. They never read a book. They just put themselves fully in the hands of the doctor. And sometimes that works great. And sometimes terrible things happen. But they don't feel as responsible for what happens, like it's the doctor's fault. And you'll hear people that say, well, the doctor saved my life with a cesarean, or it could have been worse, all these. And I'm like, they're not very invested. On the far other end of the spectrum is people who did everything right, who read every book, who prepared, who did baby yoga and positioning and ate everything right, and things can still go wrong. And so the trauma has, like, helping women lower their risk of trauma for me is to be prepared, to be empowered, but also to understand that birth isn't like other things. It isn't something you can control. You can't win. Like, it is complicated, and whatever is going to happen, you want to be most empowered for it, but be prepared know what's going on in the birth setting you choose, with the people that you have as providers. It's so hard because it's such an amazing transition for people, such a growth opportunity, and most of us aren't going to do it very often. 3 births is rare at this point. Most women are getting 1 or 2. And so you don't get to just kind of play around with it. And becoming a parent is such a enormous transition in life. And so to have that day, I used to even think that it was like, oh, it's just one day. It's not the most important day, but it is the birth of your parenting relationship. And so having it go badly does have a huge impact. So it's hard to not put too much pressure on people to get it right, because that's not fair. It's so messy and complicated, and there's always health risks and situations you have no control over. But on the other hand, it is so important that I want people to take it seriously. A great deal of the women that I know and that I work with are more on the side of that they expect to be able to control birth, and they over prepare and think that being empowered means that they can protect themselves from something going wrong. And so with them, I'm always saying, yes, and birth is messy. It's just messy. You can't imagine how it's going to go. You can't try to control every piece of it. Be prepared for whatever happens, that we'll deal with it, instead of that if we do it all right, it'll turn out beautifully.
But how to be prepared?
I know.
I mean, it's easy to say, be prepared, but how?
It's the mindset of, it's the same thing of, we want to have healthy babies. We want to have babies that turn out. We do the APGAR scores, and we weigh them and measure them, and we look at them, and they count their fingers and toes. And some of them are going to have really messy, complicated lives. And even if they had a perfect birth, that doesn't mean that everything is going to go beautifully. And we have to be ready to handle the messy, complicated things in life, which is quickly shifting gears and accepting the complications and grieving the things that we thought we were going to have. So much of life is not how we expect it. And certainly at this point in life, we've all just been through the pandemic and have had nothing go the way we expected. And the people that handled it better are the ones that were more fluid, more flexible, who could stay connected to their core values and be the person that they want to be, no matter what the outside world throws at us. And so to go into birth saying, I am ready for what happens, and it might be hard, and there might be loss, there might be things that I don't anticipate, because that's how life always is. So yeah, there's no simple answers other than being ready to be surprised by life.
I mean, do you see the differences between different women? I mean, where they come from which families they come from, and how they prepare to build.
I think that women, and even with my own births, at one point, one of my midwives said I was too educated. And I was so mad at her because I couldn't figure out how to uneducate myself in 9 months. I'd like to be uneducated. And I think her thought was, I have lived in my intellect. And I can see that now better, because that was 20 some years ago, thanks. It took me a long time to digest that information. I do tackle my life through thoughts first, and my physical or my emotional later. And that's where I want my empowerment. Like when anything happens in life, I go to the library and I start reading everything. That's how I make sense of the world. My life work is all I have in therapy is words. Like the only tool I have is words. And when I go into birth, with all 3 of my births, I became very quiet. I lose my voice and have no experience. That is not how anything else in my life works, to all of a sudden be prepared for everything except what if you can't talk. And the nice thing was, especially by my 3rd birth, I then at least at that point knew I know me. But I've also talked about it, like I had a breast cancer scare this summer where I had to have a biopsy. And I thought I was going to have to, my personal birth trauma from my first has a lot to do with general anesthesia. I have never had general anesthesia since then. Twice I've had major surgery where we thought we were going to need general anesthesia, and I just told the anesthesiologist, I hate it. Can we think of something else? And they're like, sure, if you're okay. But I went into this biopsy this past summer, and it was nice to now know me well enough. I could take the information I got from my births, because it's a similar experience. I don't know if I'm going to have cancer. I don't know. I'm putting myself in the hands of doctors. I can go read a million different websites that tell me a million different things maybe I should think about. But at some point I have to decide who to trust and who to go with. And I can only handle it as well as I can handle it. And I know me, it's not an intellectual, it's a much more gut, go with my body, go with my feelings. And so it was interesting to have learned so much. And that's one of the reasons I think processing loss and trauma is so important, because it does touch the next, whatever is next in your life. You're going to need to be ready for it. And if we're still bringing all this junk from our past, whatever we didn't deal with comes with us into the next thing. And so I learned a lot in processing my own birth trauma, that I'm never going to have another baby again. I can be of service to the women around me, but I also saw how helpful it was in dealing with some pretty serious health issues, that I know how to have. I have a friend who doulaed me through it, who said, they said, you can bring a partner. Well, I don't have a partner right now to the hospital. And then I went, oh, but Jen would be so good at this. And she's like, of course I should come. You should have somebody there with you, because you don't ask the right questions. You get scared and you stop talking. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. So it is interesting to learn on so many different levels and to be able to tap that information. All we can do as humans is to support each other through big transitions and big opportunities to grow. And I think birth should be handled like that, but shouldn't necessarily be handled in isolation, because whatever happens in birth, you're going to be a mom, and that's got its own very similar set of challenges, and feeling powerless and needing to work with other resources. And so it's maybe the first thing, but were things before that too. We don't go into birth isn't the first adventure we've had. It's not going to be the last. So
when I listened to you several times, you said, I knew that about myself. I knew that about myself. So can we tell that one of the biggest part of preparation, childbirth preparation, is knowing ourselves? Do you agree?
Yeah, and to think about, to have that, to know that when you're very young and you're doing something that you've never done before, and some of the hardest things is knowing the ego gets in the way of like, no, I'm good at that. I'm good at that. When my midwife said, you're too educated to birth, well, I didn't know what she was. It took me 10 years to really figure out what she meant. And so that wasn't very helpful for that birth. I kind of understood. I think I'm still digesting and understanding myself differently. And sometimes we only really learn who we are, under trial, tough things. Like, oh, I didn't know that about me. So that, I wish that we could be more, maybe that's how we could better support people that are preparing for birth, is to help them really look at, the one thing I often talk about is that they should look at any history of prior trauma, because we know that there are really significant triggers in birth. And so there are some things we can safely predict, that this is going to be a little intense and a little scary, and some things are going to happen that you aren't prepared for. How do you handle that in your life? What is it like for you to feel scared, to feel that that you have to make a decision very quickly under pressure, that you have to let go of things expectations that you had? This is the salt that we used in all of my rituals for the birth stories, that we would talk about releasing some of the tears. And so we would take the salt and we would all hold it while we did as we shared our stories, and then we would dissolve some of it, and we would talk about that's what the tears did, is it lets all of the salt is the tears with the choked back tears. This is what we used to release some of the choked back tears. So it has a lot of power. I remember when they woke me up, because I'd had general anesthesia, and they woke me up and first they said it was a boy, and I said no, it wasn't. And they were right. But I didn't feel the magic. I didn't feel connected. It could have been anybody's baby. It felt like it had been a year ago that I'd gone under. And to be like, what? There's a baby and it's yours, and now he's had, a bottle and procedures done that I wasn't a part of. And yeah, that disconnect was really, really tough. And my mother as well had 6 kids unmedicated births, and she was my doula for my first birth. She was wonderful, and she didn't have a clue how to help when we got into the complications, because she'd had these easy, don't worry about it. And I wanted her to believe in natural birth. That was an asset, to have somebody that believed that my body could do it. But then when my body started having a hard time, she was worthless and felt terrible about letting me down, and I felt like I let her down and all those kind of things. And yeah, we do have to deal with and who would have, I don't know if anybody could have said to me, I mean, I suppose in some ways, that if we were really looking at my birth plan, which I didn't have, well, what if things start going badly because you're feeling like you're going to try to be like your mom is going to be an issue. I'm like, I would have been, no, don't worry about that. I can handle that. You can. And then you're going to be in the middle of the birth, and it's going to be really different than you anticipated. But I don't know how we make people do that deep work of what are some of the shadows, what are some of the dark things, what are some of the things you're not ready to talk about, because those things are going to come up.
You're just ashamed even in front of yourself just to look at it.
Absolutely.
What women should do to heal their birth stories. You're writing in your book that writing, talking, and crying helps. And I wanted to ask you to tell a little bit more about crying. I loved your quote, "No one has ever died from crying. When we act like our tears can destroy us, we forget their power to heal."
Yeah, I think very sweetly. So I'm on a Facebook group for traumatic birth. This morning, a woman said today is her baby's first birthday. And she took the day off to spend the day with him, but she is afraid that the trauma will get in the way. And I answered back that she should be sad today, and she should give into the sadness, because you don't get the joy unless you give into the sadness. And she said that she doesn't think she can tell her story without tears, and she can't cry because he will cry. And it was a Facebook message, so I just walked away, and other lovely women were also giving her other ideas. But I think that we are shut down emotionally. We are told, especially when we first have our babies, that you're supposed to be happy and it's all supposed to be beautiful. And it's not all beautiful. A lot of it is not of birth, of parenting, of life. A lot of life is really hard. And just being able to be okay with give yourself, go into the pain and feel how sad it is and how unfair it is and what you lost and what you expected it to be and all that is where the idea of the bittersweetness of life, that you have to have both. And so I think that so many women just haven't given themselves permission to be sad yet, to really have the feelings that they are having. They're trying so hard. They want to get, everybody's in such a hurry to get healed. I want to be over here. I want to be done. And that's not how healing works. I mean, healing is to go into it and feel it. And however that works for you, to give yourself permission to heal it. And so for me, again, I'm a talker and a writer. And so that's the first thing that came to me. And when I was first starting to work in this area, people were starting to do a lot of birth stories. So they would have, moms would, after everybody that had had a baby this month at the birth center would get together and they would tell their birth stories. And what I started noticing is how everybody tells a sanitized, positive, uplifting, even if it's always some edited version, right, of the birth. You can't tell the whole story. So all we were giving women permission to tell was the lovely parts of the birth. And so I started asking people, come on, what was the hardest part? What was really tough? What surprised you? Is there anything that you really regret? Is there anything you really, and that just opened up a whole nother layer of the truth of parenting, birth, and everything. And so then when I started really dealing with mine, I think that's where we take some of the power out of it so that it doesn't kick our ass later. And I don't think it's just for the next birth. I think for me, my birth trauma with my first, I had the hardest time taking him to the doctor afterwards. I didn't trust doctors for a while. And I have a newborn. I have to go to the doctor a lot. And if I don't trust my relationship to medical professionals, I know a lot of women that had trauma in the hospital and then can't go back to the hospital. And that could be a real problem if suddenly your baby's very sick. And there's other things. A lot of times it does damage to the relationship with your partner or other people in your life. And if you just don't deal with it, then that is just sitting there with all of this built up energy and power behind it. And so if we don't step into it by avoiding it and thinking it'll just, and sometimes things do, some things just do go away with time. Sometimes you do just need to leave things alone, which again, you have to be really honest with yourself of, is this one of those things? Is this getting better with time or is this not? And that's what I hear from so many women is that I thought it would get better. Certainly a lot of women do face their birth traumas because of the next birth. That's often the thing that brings them to therapy or that brings them to the book and things like that. But I wish people would do it more quickly because I think it damages. It's not a great way for your psyche, for your self-esteem as a new parent to feel like you failed or that you can't trust your own body. It's not a great way to go into that first year of so much important stuff. So the sooner the better, and in many, many, many ways of healing. Everybody has their own, sometimes just being in touch with what do I need right, like that intuitiveness of what do I need right now? What does authentic self-care really mean? So we just have to be still for a moment and decide, you know what I really need today is a good cry. There are so many ways to heal, but I think so much of it is that coming close to the pain is the important part. Like giving yourself permission to be with the pain is what we kind of resist. We want to stay reserved from it, safe from it, and then I just think that it's giving yourself permission to actually delve into and some of that feels really self-indulgent, petty. I get a lot of it could be worse. And the idea that there's some limited reserve of compassion in the world, that if I take my compassion, then somebody out there doesn't get their compassion. No. The world needs so much. We could all, more compassion. And so if we just give ourselves the compassion of like, oh, that was hard. That was a loss. That was very painful. That was very scary. That doesn't cheat anybody else.
Do you think this place where we have to meet our pain and to be with it is the place where we need help?
It's more, I love doulas. I think that we should have doulas in every part of our life. I think we should have doulas to help us do anything that is hard and scary. Because I think the idea isn't that you need an expert to tell you how to do it. You need somebody to be there while you figure it out and has a little bit of ideas, a little guidance, but not imposing. And one of the reasons that I really found it important for me to write the book was because therapy is wonderful. I could sit here, I could sit over there. I love being a therapist. I love being a client. But it's not true for everybody. It isn't the answer for everybody. And it's also privileged, and it's also like you have to be able to find, like, when I first wrote the book, there were very few therapists that knew anything about birth trauma. So what was I saying? Find the 10 of us that know how to do this and talk to one of us. I think that doulas are some of the best people to talk to about birth trauma. I think finding, if your best friend has had a different experience, I think so many of the women that have had birth trauma are the best people to talk to about it. So I think it's knowing that we have a lot of this within us, but also we deserve to be supported more than necessarily told how to do it. I don't need to tell you how to heal your trauma. Again, I think most of us want to cry. I only cry in the bathtub. I have a hard time crying. I grew up in a house full of too many kids. Yeah. The only privacy was in the bathroom.
Yeah.
Then with my own kids, the only privacy was in the bathroom. I think the only place I feel like I have privacy is the bathroom. And so every once in a while I will turn on the shower and I will let myself cry.
Yeah.
And then when you come out, you don't look like you've been crying because you were in the shower. But what would it be like if that wasn't true? What if we were actually okay to cry with people and be that vulnerable with people and share the whole experience of how disappointing sometimes our life.
You said something very important right now about psychotherapists. They don't know how to work with birth trauma. Why?
I don't know. I don't know why. There's so much to learn in grad school about all of the different things that we have to know about people's psyche. And so when I first became a psychologist and was in private practice, I thought that postpartum depression was the same as all the other depressions. It just is a timing thing. Like if you had a baby and now you're depressed, you have postpartum depression. That is not at all the case. It is its own creature that has very different experience. Trauma, I think we're now becoming a world where we talk about being trauma informed. And I think some of it is what we've learned about how the brain works and how healing works. And there's a lot that we're figuring out about psychology that is brand new. And so nicely, we are now learning that probably we all have micro traumas, we all have losses that haven't been processed, that these things that came on a personal level, on a socioeconomic level, that these things are what kind of put us at risk for mental health issues. And so if we can learn how to do this, but that's all really new. And so when I first started rolling around birth trauma, 20 years ago, there was nothing. And so we were all kind of inventing this as we went along. And so at this point here in the Twin Cities here, I feel like we have a very healthy home birth community. We have a really healthy doula community. And so I feel like, here I could get you a therapist pretty easily. But I'm very deeply involved in the postpartum depression, the perinatal mood specialist world. So I know the people here do a pretty good job of it. But I also know that you could just pop into any therapist next door and they would have been like, yeah, never heard of it. Because if they're not doing the work, it's not in anybody's, it's not kind of common information. Of course we want to get over it, whatever that means. I don't want to still be upset. It would be nice if it would just heal naturally. And for a lot of women it does. And then there are those of us that it's like, oh yeah, no, for some reason that just, and it's true of anything. It's true of car accidents that sometimes we walk away and we're like, wow, I could have died. And other times you're like, you're devastated by what happened. And it's not that easy to predict how, especially with the psyche, how we're going to react to things, what things we're going to hang on to, why some things just stick. And now we have a fear of dogs because that one thing that happened with a dog, whereas other people are like, why are you afraid of dogs? And so we're getting better, and yet it is definitely still a complicated world. And so I just feel like the more people can be aware of that not everybody's birth story is something they can easily share, or that the birth story people are sharing is often sanitized and partial. I think almost every birth has a couple ugly moments. There were some pretty weird things that happened, and I think that even in the most traumatic birth, there are some absolutely glorious, beautiful things that happen. And so it's not an all or nothing experience. It's being able to actually dance with the complexity of it that helps if you've got somebody that's listening for complexity. This was my divorce and going through fully through menopause. The same time I went through my divorce and menopause, and so this was the celebration of letting go of that part of my life. So.
Do we need to heal or process any birth story, or just the birth story that is a birth trauma too?
I love that in a midwifery model of care, I think that there's more time to talk about how it went and to process it. And it's one of the reasons I really believe in midwives and doulas, because I think with a traditional hospital birth, no one's going to ask you how it went.
Yeah.
You know, and if you walk in 6 weeks later and the nurse who wasn't your nurse, who's maybe never seen you before or never only seen you in the clinic, says, "So, how are things going?" You get this much of an answer. There's so much, we're missing a lot of things. And so I think the sooner we can have just a debriefing, you know, if we just look at it as that probably in most well-supported births, there's the next day where you're talking about, so how did you feel about it and how did it go? And were there any surprises? Like some of that, the most helpful thing is to have that processing happen fairly quickly by somebody who really gets it and can listen and can ask the right questions, or couldn't even say, wow, I was, own some of their own, like that one was a little intense, or I didn't expect it to go that long, or whatever kind of feedback that can really help us really consider our experience. And so the hard part is that so much of the way our system works is that the focus is on the baby, not on the mother. Yeah. And all that matters is how is the baby? And that's where all of the energy gets focused. And so we miss this opportunity to actually talk about this amazing thing that just happened. And I do a lot of couples work, and one of the things that I find fascinating is how seldom couples have never talked about. Like they've never even asked each other, how did it go? Because we were in the same room together, we did not have the same experience. Couldn't have had a more different experience. One of us had a baby come out of them and the other stood there and did some really lovely things, but that is not the same experience. But it's a dramatic experience for both of us. And the fact that we're so busy and we've got this new baby and the whole family's there and there's all this other stuff going on, it's amazing to me how seldom people have had a chance to talk about, to just check in with, how did that go? Anything that you wanted to share about it, or anything confusing? And so yeah, anybody that can help us process big experiences like that, I think it really helps. I think that the more we process it, the less likely it's going to get kind of stuck in that trauma response of the thing that we're fighting with that we don't want to acknowledge. Or we're going to be able to pull apart the pieces that we can tell that there's just some moments, there are some things that I'm not happy about. But the whole experience is not just those bad parts.
How long does it take usually for a woman to tell her birth story?
When I first started doing my groups, we would have about 10 women, and at that point, my co-therapist, Serena, and I would give people time to tell what they wanted to tell. And we thought they would spend 5 minutes each, and we would have to shut them down after 15, 20 minutes of telling. And this was just like, just tell us. And we really were inviting them to tell us a piece, and they couldn't. There was no nut. They wanted to tell. And that was the wonderful experience of being in a group of people that were really safe and really understood. And I have had some women that have had to tell me their story, and once they started, I couldn't stop them. And I've had hour-long, 2-hour-long birth stories, which if I can do it, I'll do it. But I think more importantly, what I like is kind of the layers. Like a lot of times if a woman comes in for individual therapy, I will say, well, tell me the story. And just like when you ask me, to tell me my kind of life story, where do we start? Because for a lot of people, their experience about what they like trying to get pregnant, previous pregnancies or losses, or their feelings around where pregnancy landed in their life and their relationship is all part of that. And then they start talking about it all was going along pretty well until, and then the first things that started to be like the precursors of things got a little messy. This isn't what I expected. It started to be more complicated. And so I'll let people tell me their story. And a lot of times the answer is that we get to the end and we go back to the beginning and we do it again. And then we go back to the beginning and we do it again. Because you get a different layer of truth. You get a different depth of understanding. Because so many people have shut them down and only let them tell the 3-minute sense cleaned up version. I try to do, tell me again. Just tell me again. Let's tell me again. And it doesn't have to be the same story. It isn't the same story. It's a different version of the story. That's part of what we're working towards, is moving it to a different story so that it doesn't kick our ass every day. So it doesn't feel like it's raw and alive all the time. We're getting to a story that's a little bit more past focused, like it did happen and I did survive it and I did come out of it and I am okay.
How long does it take for a woman to heal the birth story then?
I hardly remember. With Nate's birth, he's 38. I'm over it. The fact that I still am a little weird about, getting general anesthesia, if I'd had to, I would have done it. It's not deeply impacting my life. I think I probably parented a little bit more anxiously because of my birth. And I think it took a long time to really notice that, I don't like being separated from my kids. And I think that was probably my separation at the birth. And that took forever to figure out, like, I think I set off on a journey of parenting based on my trauma that then just became my journey. And you can't go back and totally undo it. I had a woman who gave birth she had a horribly traumatic birth in the unit she worked on. She was a labor and delivery nurse. She birthed in her unit and she had a horrible birth. She had to go back to work 2 months later in the place where the trauma occurred as a labor and delivery nurse. And we worked our butts off to do her work so that she could be ready. Because we talked about options and she's like, it doesn't make sense. This is a good job. I love my job. I need to be able to go there and be a nurse. That does not happen very often where there's this kind of time frame. I've had women that walk into my office 8 weeks before their baby is due, and they're like, I want to be ready for this birth. And I'm like, we got some work to do. Because there's a time frame, and that doesn't mean that it's going to be all done, but it should be at a level where it's a lot better for whatever reason. So I think it can be done kind of high power pressure, which seems like a stupid way to do therapy, but sometimes that is necessary. Mostly, I think every time we tell the story, we transform it, and it's less raw, and it's less. We have more power over it, and we have more awareness of it, and it's less. It's less traumatic, and so it can be. Sometimes it just goes back to the shelf, and you're like, I haven't thought about it for a while, and then birthdays come up, or somebody else has a baby, or you're watching some horrible TV show, and you're like, oh my God, that is not either a good birth or a bad birth. And all of a sudden, all of those feelings come up. And then you have a choice. You can avoid it and just put it back on the shelf. Or you can be like, I think I need to talk about this again. Or I think I really need to give some thought to this again. I think we pick it up and put it back down a lot. But I think that if people are really committed to doing the work for whatever reason, often another pregnancy or something's in the way, then kind of giving yourself the permission. But it's that centering yourself. Like, are you willing to make this be a priority? Most people can't find time to do therapy, that no one has time to journal and meditate. Like, we're all way too busy to do those things. And yet, if you want to feel better, you kind of have to invest a little bit of time in research.
When you invest, if just you see this women, the stories that really are being processed, they're working on it, they're doing their work, they're trying hard because they see that they're stuck, How long does it take to heal the birth story?
So I think of like if you fall and you tear your knee open, and we've all fallen off our bike and we've got that, you watch it heal. And it gets smaller and it gets crunchy.
Okay, at least to the point when it doesn't bleed anymore.
Right. So there might be scars, and it might still be, but I think the not bleeding part, like, oh, I can actually walk.
Yeah.
I think if people put a month into therapy, journaling, talking to people, really crying a lot, I think it can make a huge difference. I think that if you give yourself, I heard something as a therapist that if we do this with our little kids, but if you can give a negative feeling 90 seconds, it will move. And we have a hard time being with our feelings for 90 seconds. So the idea that, I'm going to give a month to my trauma, I'm too busy. I'd rather do the dishes, But I do think that just like visiting the pain for 90 seconds makes a difference. And so it's when we get stuck. Trauma has us stuck in an unprocessable pain. And then it owns us, it controls us, and we choose to pick it up and deal with it. I'm not going to be controlled by this. I'm not going to run away from it. And I think that's the harder thing, because it means it does get worse before it gets better in some ways. It's never too late, because we don't know who's going to need us for something, For me, if I hadn't processed my births, I would have been a terrible therapist for other people, and I wouldn't have even known I was a terrible therapist. And when my sisters started having infertility issues, when my friends started having loss, like I would have just zoned out. Like I would have just not been very present with people that had anything that even touched on the thing I was avoiding. And who knows what that would have looked like to not, like how deep does that go? That I'm just not, my life is fine as long as we don't touch anything that touches the trauma. And then not trusting doctors. That was a big thing for me, and it wasn't not trusting doctors. It was, I think the biggest issue was I didn't trust myself to stand up to doctors, to ask good questions and to challenge. And I was 20 and they were the smart ones and I was scared. And I think that's still today, there's still a question of, when I got this breast cancer scare, and do you just do what the doctors tell you to do? Or do you argue with them on every single thing and tell them that you Googled it and you've got all the answers because I Googled something? But I feel pretty confident about my ability to challenge doctors in a healthy way. And I think that's part of working through my birth trauma, is that I figured out how I am that I can't always talk about it in the moment, but I can get back to you. The problem with birth is that doesn't work very well, which is why having advocates and other people that can stand up for you. But being able to figure out that it's not unusual that I didn't feel like a very good advocate for myself doesn't mean that I'm not going to be able to advocate in the future. And so some of those things just have such long reach into our lives that it's not just about birth.
Can we talk about the impact on partners' relationship? I mean, with unresolved birth stories or post-trauma.
The research says there is just as many men with birth trauma stories as there are women. And nobody's asking dads their birth trauma. If nobody was asking moms, nobody is asking
Even
dads.
less people are asking that.
Right. And dads don't go to 6-week appointments. Dads don't get any follow-up care because they weren't a patient. So that affects the relationship. The letting each other down, the having a different experience, the what we were afraid of is very different. Often that comes out at the second birth, because all of a sudden, if a woman has had a traumatic birth, her decision about how she wants to handle the second birth is deeply impacted by that. And so it's either a totally different plan or exactly the same plan, or, I'm going to birth at home because I birthed at a hospital, or a hospital because I birthed at home, all those things. And she gets it all figured out. This is how I feel empowered. And her husband says, no way. After what we went through, how can you even consider putting yourself at that kind of risk? I'm afraid you're going to die. I can't see you go through that again. I can't handle the fear. I can't do it again. In some version of no babies or a different birth plan or whatever. And those things are really hard, because often that's when you find out that both of them have been suffering in silence in very different ways and haven't even checked in. And again, men in our culture are taught that to just kind of walk it off and be tough and it doesn't bother you and you have to just be brave and she needs you. And so, and they don't have, who are they going to talk to about it? They're not on Facebook sharing birth stories. So I just think that, and that's my favorite. My specialty is working with families with young kids and helping with marriage a lot. But it is the core value stuff of like, wait a minute, what do we really care about? What do we really want? How can we really let our children transform us and become different people by loving them? How do we take the hard parts of life and make them really great lessons? But try to do that together instead of in silent isolation.
So why don't we talk about those stories loud enough?
The idea that it shouldn't matter so much, that we should be over it, that I think we have some problems with that everybody should be happy and everybody should feel good and we shouldn't dwell on the negatives. I think that we have a misunderstanding of how we move on. I think the impatience of just move on rather than the work is the way to move on. It isn't a skip over everything and move on. And I think that's so much of what we told people is that we tell people that about their childhoods, that you should just get over it. That, are you still stuck on that? That was a long time ago. Your parents did the best they could, whatever. And I think similar to be able to be like, I'm not blaming it. I'm just informed by it. The story is a rich one, and it brings a lot of meaning to my experience. And so I want to go back and revisit it. I want to look at it because it does help. And if we can't, anything that we're not wanting to look at has too much power. And I think that's what we've told people, is to just move on. We just very much have told people that get over it and move on and do the next thing. And on some level, if you can, but the price is high. The price is high for people that just decide that, well, I can't ever deal with my birth, so I will just move on and not deal with it. It has such a deep impact. Whereas the richness is go in and deal with it, have the feelings, and let it move and unlock it. And you will feel so much better.
How it is to feel that the birth trauma, the birth story is healed, or it's not bleeding anymore and it's covered already with a new layer. How does it feel?
I think that when you can tell the story, there's a richness of a fullness of the good and the bad, that it's integrated, that it's clearly what happened, and it has deep meaning. It's not amnesia. It's not that you don't you still remember the pain, but you don't feel the pain like it's still raw. That it gets to be, I know how important my birth was. I know what I went through. I can share the richness. And that gives us so much more ability to hear other people's stories when our story isn't getting in the way.
What are you working on right now? I mean, what topic drives you?
I am actually working on, my second book will be about divorce. I think the hardest part is that I believe that people stay in bad marriages too long and don't feel like they have permission to just decide that it's time to move on. And so I've been helping couples do a lot more honest mediating and creative problem solving of what is working in our family and what isn't, and making some really tough decisions about that. So I want to write a really creative book about how to decide when to move on.
What is your biggest dream?
I think I really just love continuing to be transformed by relationships. I see the world as just a series of how we impact people. And so I just am excited for what's the next chapter of my life of not being all about mothering is going to be a big, exciting adventure.